Hi, I'm Sharon Corwin, the Carolyn Muzzy Director and Chief Curator here at the Colby College Museum of Art, and it's such a pleasure to welcome you all here this morning for our conversation with the artist Rackstraw Downes, who I am absolutely delighted and thrilled to be able to lead in conversation. Rackstraw and I were just talking about how far we go back. He was one of the first artists I did a studio visit with in my role as curator here many, many years ago. Also, your painting of the Fresh Kills landfill, I saw it on my very first tour of this museum, of these galleries, before I even was hired for this job. And it was really, Rackstraw, one of the reasons I came here. It's such an extraordinary painting. It's currently on view in the museum, along with two other great works by Rackstraw, one of the Hathaway Shirt Company, a subject here in Waterville, which you can see in the Alphon Lunder Family Pavilion, and also an extraordinary drawing of the Bergen power plant, which is given to us by the Alex Katz Foundation. So we're thrilled to have these on view for you to see. We're also going to be running through some slides of images of Rackstraw's work over the decades, so you'll get a chance to see more of his work and enjoy those as well. So Rackstraw, thank you for being here. I should also say Rackstraw reminded me that I shared my dissertation with him, which I was kind of horrified by, and that he actually read it, which was so generous. So, but I just am delighted to have you here. It's an honor to be giving you the Cummings Award for Artistic Excellence later today at the Luncheon.
Thank you so much.
So Rackstraw, I wanted to start at the very beginning. You were born in England, you studied English literature in college, and then in the early 60s you came to the Yale School of Art, where you studied with Al Held, who was one of your teachers, along with Neil Welliver and Alex Katz. And it was there at Yale that you were really learning geometric abstraction. You had a number of classmates who went on to become famous artists, Nancy Graves, Chuck Close, Richard Serra, and others, Bryce Marden, Janet Fish. And it seems like what an exciting place to be at that moment in the early 60s. But if we can get the slideshow started, there's a great image of Rackstraw's work from this period. Here it is. There you are. Actually, you're not there, but this is one of your works from that period. Can you talk a little bit, Rackstraw, about what you were painting at that moment and what abstraction meant to you, and then ultimately why you left it? Why did you kind of move on into a figurative practice? And what was art school like? I can only imagine that kind of that energy that was there at that moment.
Well, first let me just comment on that first slide there of the painting being moved into place. That one of the two people who are holding that painting up there are Chuck Close and Richard Serra. In case you
just Chuck Close and Richard Serra.
So that is
nice. You can put them to work.
Yes. But school, we didn't know that Yale was an exceptional school. We were actually inside the fishbowl, and we couldn't really see what it looked like from outside. And I think that it was very exciting. And I think one of the issues was a main issue, perhaps, that there was a feeling among the people of my generation that something really distinctive and marvelous and grand and great had happened in the 1950s in American painting, and it was therefore behooves you to shoot for the absolute top. You weren't messing around with any, this sort of, this is pretty good, or this serves, to be rated very close to very good art. There was no question about it, that this was the center. The center had moved across the Atlantic, and here was a special moment where you had to go in, and unless you were shooting for the top, you weren't really regarded very highly. And it was a difficult moment. People, there were some people who were fathers of children already, mothers of children, and they didn't, it was very tricky. You could be offered a job in Alaska, with very good health benefits, but should you go to Alaska? Was that a serious idea? And if not, how on earth did you deal with the horrible mess and a great deal of rundown property and poor conditions of things in New York life? And how did you cope with all those situations? And I think that coping then became a very interesting, almost a topic in itself. The loft, for example, became a venue, you know, for where you make things, and it changed the style, I think. That art was not so polite as it was in Guy Pen-Dubois' era, you know. It wasn't a polite art form, it was a rough form, it was a tough form, it was a deep form. And the arguments sound quite crude sometimes and even naive to us now, but I think it was partly that crudeness and naivete in the souls of people. I mean, you read de Kooning's writings of that period, they're absolutely marvelous, they're hilariously funny, and they're not serious attempts like Valéry or something. You know, they're a different class of writing, and so that's what I would say to that.
And I mean, it was a really different time at that point, but it was, you made a conscious decision to move against abstraction pretty soon after you left Yale. You didn't move to Alaska, but you moved to Maine. In 1974, pretty soon after, about a decade after you graduated from Yale, you came up to see Neil Welliver. And then you soon after bought a farm in Montville where you stayed through 1989. So Maine was a really big part of your practice for many, many years. But importantly, it wasn't just that it was a new site for you, it was a new mode of making art. You were working now in a figurative idiom. And I just wonder what it was like for you at this moment where the kind of hegemony of abstract expressionism, geometric abstraction, color field held so strongly to the art field. I mean, at one point you were, this is a great quote from you, you were reviewing a 1961 show at the Yale Art Gallery that included Alex Katz and Fairfield Porter, and you said, I decided that these painters were Dadaists playing pranks at the expense of old-fashioned painting. And so in many ways you were pointing to the radical nature of something like a painting by Fairfield Porter or Alex Katz at that moment. And you took up your own kind of radical language at that moment. Do you think of it that way, or what did it mean to be a figurative painter at that moment is really what I'm asking.
Well, I think that some people felt that there was a sort of permission system. You had to get permission for your art, or it had to somehow represent, like, as though, because it took this form, it had received a permit to perform and behave and make these things. And that wasn't really permitted to Porter and Katz and company. It really wasn't. And I didn't recognize them as being artists of interest at first. I saw the paintings on the wall and thought they were dreadful. And it's very much more complicated than one thinks, because I told that story to Fairfield Porter and he said, well, I thought they were dreadful too.
What was dreadful about them?
I thought they were crude. Yes, I thought they were crude. And the students a year ahead of me who had studied with Alex, for example, did not find those pictures crude, but they sorted them out a little bit. They were on the very edge of crudeness, because I remember him saying, one guy saying, you know, that, well, the tree was great, but the bush was too much. It was too much. And so you could really kind of pick and choose between these things, you know. There was a skepticism, even by those who practiced that kind of art. And then there was a stalwart like Janet Fish. It was interesting, the range. She was traditional from the beginning, absolutely from the beginning. And she'd grown up in Bermuda, where there was a traditional sculptor there who did elaborate programs of sculpture. And she could do, for example, a biblical scene, and all the portraits were recognizable members of the island of Bermuda where they lived. And that was very peculiar, very different from anything that was going on elsewhere. So Janet always was rooted somehow in that tradition and admired that sculptor and respected her very highly. So I don't know if that answers your question.
It does, thank you. Well, let's talk more about Maine. What was it that drew you here? And I wonder, was Maine part of what gave you permission to work in a different way? And Can you say
well,
more
in a
about what you
subtle
found
way,
here?
it was. Let me first say that I was only in Maine. I was only summer folks. I was never.
That's right. That's right. That's important.
I never stayed all round.
Right. So
I couldn't do it. I couldn't have done it. I couldn't have done it.
So you would spend summers in Montville,
right,
in the farm that you had,
yes.
and then you would spend the rest of your time during these years in New York.
In New York,
right.
That's correct.
Right.
Yes. And one day Alex said to me, it's kind of weird to be painting these Maine paintings in this little studio here on the East 85th Street, I wonder. And I thought, yes, it is a little strange. And it does feel a little bit split, as though you're split, But it was only very, very slowly that I found other ways to work in the city that were not Maine imagery dependent. Mm-hmm. I worked very hard at figuring out what kind of imagery to work with, and it was much later, after I'd been to Italy, actually, that I thought of painting a townscape. And then after I visited Belgium and Holland, painting portraits in the sort of Memling school type idea, based on that. Of course, I couldn't paint like that. It had, as Fairfield Paul says, tradition is in the stroke. And I had no connection whatsoever to those strokes in those paintings. Mm-hmm. I had to paint with a bristle brush and make large, chunky, I don't know if there were any up there, but large, chunky brush strokes there for a number of years. And it only gradually, sort of got more and more involved with some idea of completeness, of inclusion, that I wanted to tell more stories more accurately, more precisely. Mm-hmm. And the work then kind of got narrowed down to rather more high-focused realism, really.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, let's talk a bit about the stories you were telling and the subjects you were painting, because in both Maine and New York, you were drawn to, well, let's start with Maine. Like, you weren't painting Bellows Monhegan or Homer's Prout's Neck or even Hartley's Vinyl Haven. You were finding instead the banal, the quotidian, the everyday. You were interested in cement factories and chicken coops and overpasses in New York and dumps. And so what was it, Rackstraw, about these sites? What stories did you want to tell in them? And why that version of a landscape rather than the really traditionally bound one that it seems you were working against?
I'm not sure I was working against it at first. Mm-hmm. I think at first when I arrived in Maine, I was very content with the pastoral, and the agricultural and so on. I was very interested. One thing you brought up was that you could see what was going on in these paintings. I actually discussed my paintings with farmers and people who worked the land because I wanted to get the darn thing right. And somebody would say, well, I would never leave my rake out there on a pile of chicken stuff out there. I wouldn't do it because the thing would rust to death, And so I learned things from them. I learned important things from people who practiced agriculture, who lived the rural life in Maine. And I found it very, very touching and very interesting indeed. And it also had an effect on the style of my own work, not just the imagery. Because, there's a certain kind of modesty of style or low-key style of painting, which is not at all, or even as Proust called it, the mild style of painting, that can be very highly ambitious. It doesn't have to be a soutine, every time kind of thing, with the sparks flying. It may be something more serious and more low-key. And one of the key people in that was Joseph Fiore, of course, who was working in Maine at that time and showed at the Maine Coast Artists. And his work was very sober and very quiet. And I was extremely moved by that. And I thought it had parallels to the low-key lives that a lot of these people led up there. And I liked the fact that they sharpened their tools and looked after them and they didn't toss them away after one use, that kind of thing. And I remember when I first relocated to Houston, Texas, at an opening, I was talking to a gentleman there and I said, I'd like to get a little boat and go up the intracoastal waterway and explore it from the water, it'd be a wonderful trip. He said, why don't you get a big boat? And I thought, I have moved.
That's how they do it in Texas.
I realized that I had moved from one environment to
Well, Rackstraw, it's so interesting, one of the words you just used, a kind of modest style, and I think that really is applicable to your entire practice. And something I also think about when I think about your work is pace and time. And one of the great things that artists can do is they can help us see better. And I kind of think of you as a great observer. And what you realize when you look at Rackstraw's work, which I hope you'll do, is you have to spend time with it. You actually require of your viewers, or rather, your viewer is rewarded by spending time with your painting. And these are also paintings that take months, if not years, for you to paint. And there's a way in which time kind of slows down, and it's not the kind of bravura of a Soutine or the quickness of a Pollock or something. Instead, it's a kind of it operates on a different register. And can you just talk about how you think about time and pace and patience, really? I think your work requires not just a patience of you to paint them, but a patience of us to look at them.
Well, I think it's very nice if people do spend some time with my paintings, and I'm disappointed when they don't. It is also not good to see them displayed at a great distance, because there's a lot you don't see. Right. You really don't. And they are meant to be looked at up close, and they're painted up close too. There was something else I wanted to say there. But well, go ahead. What was it?
The patience, the pace, the timing.
Oh yes, the time. Yes, the time.
How long it takes you? The commitment that you make to each canvas seems quite great.
Yes. Well, I'm cautious about that. I make a lot of drawings in preparatory to my painting, and they're not exactly finished drawings at all. They're not really works on paper. Neither are they exactly just sketches, preliminary sketches. They're more explorations of the shape that the paint will take and what kinds of light happen during the course of a day. When you first set up there, it's weather X, and then you go back 2 days later and it's weather Y. So you have to get all your painting to be weather savvy. You have to be weather savvy yourself, you know. Yeah.
Well, you also have to be tenacious. I mean, there's these great images of you with your shower cap on and your tarp. I mean, the physical stamina that this requires of you to go out into so you don't take any shortcuts. There's no photographs involved.
No.
It's every day out on the site with your easel, sometimes 2 easels to hold these extra long paintings, your canvases, your paints, and you've got a lot of stuff to carry out there. And so that physicality and that, again, kind of commitment to the practice just feels really powerful in your work.
Well, I'm glad it does. What can I say?
Well, Rackstraw, let's talk a little bit more about the landscape tradition.
Sure.
Because I think you're right. Your work did start out very much a part of that. But it seems like going forward, you were always kind of working in an anti-romantic mode. And so I think if I had to think about, and so I guess what I'm really interested in is your relationship to an American tradition of landscape painting. Because Constable or even Whistler painting in London, I think there's interesting affinities between his shop fronts or his alleys or the way he's interested in the industrialization of the Thames that I think of when I think of your work. But it's not, it's certainly not Bierstadt.
No, it's not, no.
You're not interested in those majestic mountains.
No, I hate rhetoric.
Say more. So how do you...
Well, you know, it started early. I mean, when I was a hard edge painter, an abstract painter, it started out with Mondrian was my first love. Mondrian is a very severe painter. As de Kooning said of him, he's a merciless artist who never has anything left over. And that's right, you know, he really does shave those lines to exactly where they're supposed to be. And that kind of diligence and need to be, and he's a bit solemn too, that guy. Supposedly he was impossible to dance with, that he knew the dance steps absolutely correctly, and if the gal couldn't keep up with him, he wasn't interested. And the thought of that is very intriguing to me, and I have to say. maybe the farmer's wife wouldn't be interested in my painting if it showed something wrong, So there are some analogies there, I think, from the very beginning.
Do you think, can you talk about the kind of Americanness? Is that a part? Are you showing us a particular version of America?
I probably am by virtue solely of having lived here a long time.
Right.
That the longer I lived here, I remember when I was first asked to write for Art News, I went to be interviewed by Tom Hess, the editor-in-chief, and he said, "Now, do you write British or American English?" I said, "What do you mean?" So he said, "Well, how do you spell colour?" Oh, I said, "With a U, of course." So, you don't shed it all, and you don't shed it quickly. And there's something in there, that probably somebody else said, "Oh, this is not the light of New York; it's the light of London." And I thought, "Oh, pooh! That's because you live here and you want it to be the light of London." I don't think that it's the light of London at all. I think it's something quite ordinary to me.
Mm-hmm. I want to get back to some of the things you're doing in New York and its environs, which are really showing us. Again, not the subjects that we're used to seeing in painting. And the critic, Peter Schledahl, has a great line that I just have to quote. So he's talking about how you're really interested in these quotidian overlooked subjects and things like the dumps, for instance.
Right.
And he says that you know and cherish these places like a doting mother of career criminals. I mean, it kind of doesn't get better than that.
No, it doesn't.
No.
That's a very cool line.
Isn't that a great line? But did you feel that way? Did you feel a kind of responsibility to these dumps and these overpasses?
You do. But first of all, I had a responsibility towards society. And I think that society, out of sight, out of mind, we are like that. And we think we can bring electricity out to our house in the middle of the woods, but we can't without cutting some trees down. We can't without digging ditches which cut roots and so forth and so on. You can't have those things without the power lines. They're part of it. And I want to just remind people that landscape can be a very sentimental genre and say, "Oh yes, look at this mall here. When I was a kid, I rode my horse here and learned to ride, and so on and so forth." And it's very soppy, but then we go into the mall and order a latte, and to what extent did we really feel that way? It's terrible nostalgia. So I wanted any hypocrisy. I'm on the warpath against.
Well, which I love about your work and really your life. Can you talk more about where you see environmentalism in your work? I mean, I think it's a part of your painting, but you've also made it a part of your life. You've made significant decisions to reduce your carbon footprint. As we think here at Colby about environmental studies, environmental humanities, you seem like somebody we should be learning from.
Well, I don't know if you can learn from a person who shops at Patagonia, but maybe. They do have recycling programs there. You buy a shirt and you take it back after a couple of years, and they save the buttons and some of the threads and so on. And I believe in that. I absolutely believe in that in a very literal sense. I'm a Whole Foods person, or I used to be up until it was sold. I'm not sure where it's going.
But it gets back to the small boat, big boat. And it gets back to maybe some of the lessons you learned in Maine early on.
It does.
And
well, that was very beautiful. I mean, I thought that the farming was very touching to me, that these people really wanted to look after their equipment, and they weren't going for the biggest thing, and they didn't value bigness either, or novelty or whatever. I remember a summer folk person saying, "I've got the best damn rutabagas around here," or something. And somebody said, "You have?"
Uh-oh. Was it Rutabaga Wars?
It wasn't. But it was just it was like saying, "Who cares about that?" So what?
Right.
That kind of thing.
Right.
I like that very much, and don't brag. I like that idea very much. And that was a main thing, a thing which I learned, I think, from Maine behavior. I was very shocked when I got here. I must say that a guy who came to do some plastering in my house said, he said, "Do you like living here?" I said, "Yes, I do." He said, "That's because during the Depression, Maine never voted for FDR for all those goddamn programs. And there was a sort of self-help thing that was very touching and very beautiful. And it entered into my painting, it really did. It did.
So, Rackstraw, let's talk more about the Fresh Kills painting. And its full title, importantly, is Garbage Arriving at Fresh Kills in Barges is Hauled to the Top of the Landfill in Athey Wagons. So, first of all, that's a mouthful.
It is.
So let's start with the title. So your titles are important to you. And
they're very important.
Sometimes they have a real narrative
They're very
quality.
important, yes. They do have a narrative quality. I wish to draw attention to the fact that I'm not simply painting gorgeous light and gorgeous mountains or whatever, I'm not responding to what's already known and accepted as pretty.
So it's important to have garbage,
well,
barges,
it's important
landfill.
It's important to know where your
on?
garbage goes. What are you doing when you toss this in the garbage?
Right.
And we're not very good at that, really. I mean, New York City sells its garbage to Pennsylvania or pays Pennsylvania to take its garbage. There's extraordinary things going on behind the scenes. And I wanted to bring out into the forefront, the process of a dump. And the fact that the Fresh Kills dump, which is the biggest dump in the world, I believe, is run in exactly the same way as the dump in Centre Montville. It's really, neither is much of an improvement on the other in terms of really recycling stuff. It's improved somewhat since 1960s, but it was still pretty laissez-faire about that stuff. Yeah, I wanted to really show also, I was very fortunate to be living next door to somebody who worked in the sanitation department in New York, and they were beginning to give rides, tours of the Fresh Kills, including, and they said that most of their the people who came for the ride were Japanese. Japan, of course, is an island that can't get rid of stuff so easily without sending it overseas. You've only got so much space, and it's not increasing. And Japan, I understand, is the only country in the world right now that has a decreasing population. And it is almost as though we've reached saturation point, and the Japanese are ahead of us in realizing that we have to pull back from this madness. So those things are all on my mind when I'm working in there. But I don't want to say hen houses are bad or anything of that nature. It doesn't interest me in editorializing. I'd like to present the scene and say, what do you think?
Right.
And so the pictures asks people, what do you think? Do you like me? And, I think we think that we look at pictures, but I think pictures are looking back at us. And they're asking this very important question, do you like me? Are you interested in me? And that, I think, is the essential question that all art asks.
That's beautiful. I mean, it's interesting to think of a dump asking us, "Do you like me?" And one of the interesting things about your painting is, and you've said this about this painting, that you saw it as a correction to industrial destruction. Right. And what is so prescient and extraordinary is that now the city of New York is reclaiming Fresh Kills as a public park. It will be the largest public park in the New York City area in the last 100 years that they have created, or reclaimed is a better word. It will be 3 times the size of Central Park. And so in many ways, and this will be a place for recreation. In fact, I should read to you from the New York Parks website. They talk about how the park's design and programming will emphasize environmental sustainability and a renewed public concern for our human impact on the earth. Your painting predicted all of that. I'm like, did you guys call RACstraw for that quote?
No. There was a thorough movement going that I had tagged into. My mother actually was interested in these things and knew I was too. And it went right back to, who was that guy, Huxley, who wrote Sight Without Glasses or something like that. It went back to the idea of trying to sort of remake things in a very simple way. And she was interested in those things, and she sent me a magazine from England called the Journal of progressive agriculture or something like that. And the cover, on one of the covers, one of the issues, it has a picture of a Cadillac being towed by 2 horses. And it says underneath the shape of things to come, ? And they're talking about, wanting to stage some kind of sensible revolution. It was a little rough at the beginning, but I did know people who were involved with that. And Welliver, for example, was very involved with that. And I respected it and liked it and wanted somehow to let it seep into all my work, So on the whole, I haven't made anything that doesn't have some reference, for a very long time anyway, that doesn't have some reference to, the industry of being in the country, of living a rural life that's sustainable. Even those early paintings of cows around a pond, that too had to do with the processes of agriculture. And there was nothing organic about his particularly his production, but it made you feel that there was something here that wasn't mindlessly ripping up things, or just tearing hell for leather down the turnpike with this gasoline, which is no, you can't find any, you can't get it in England, or it's rationed or something like that. There's a sort of thoughtlessness about that I don't like to see.
Rackstraw, tell us more about the mechanics of making these paintings, and maybe even the Fresh Kills painting, which seems like, how long did it take? What did it mean to be standing on the edge of a dump for months, almost years?
It took a whole summer.
Yeah, a whole summer.
That's easy to answer. Yes, it took a whole summer. And I got permission, as I say, but through my next-door neighbor. I doubt if otherwise I would have been able to get permission. And then followed many, many drawings, and I decided the main thing I wanted to do was to include from one end to the other the whole procedure that took place. Now that meant a very, very long canvas, and it does contain the whole procedure more or less. And I made many, many sketch drawings to see where to stand, to get a viewpoint that I could see that. And that's common in many of my paintings. There's a painting of the dam at Fairfield right here, in which at either end of the painting the river disappears. And I felt either for the sake of the composition and of the sense of the picture, it should disappear. It should disappear. I must make the canvas long enough so that it can. And that happened. Things like that happened in a lot of my paintings, to make them long, to tell some story. Yeah.
Do you remember painting the Hathaway?
Oh, yes, I do.
Can you tell us, did you stand on the bridge?
I stood on the bridge, and the traffic coming in the morning was quite outrageous. One day, one guy rolled down his window there, and he yelled out, "You left out one brick."
No!
I thought that was a very good critique, actually, and I called up my art supply store guy in New York, and I said, "Send me some tiny sable brushes so I can get these bricks in here."
So tell us about Texas. So you left Maine for good in 1989. You came back for a few times to be a faculty member at the Skowhegan School of Painting and Sculpture.
That's right.
And you painted there as well.
Yes.
But you said goodbye to Maine. Why?
I did.
And what did you find in Texas? And I should say, even when you were in Texas, you were still coming back to New York at your studio on Green Street at that point. So what did you need? What did your art need that Maine could no longer provide that you found in Texas?
Maine provided richly so many things, and then suddenly one day I was painting along a line of hills near Montville, and my arm said, "Cut this out. You've done this enough." And it is about interior energy. Art comes from interior energy. I think the idea of inspiration because of the landscape is so beautiful that you have to stop from everything and paint it. I don't subscribe to that. It seems a little peculiar to me. But anyway, I just had that strong feeling in my hand that I'd done it. I'd done this to death, and I didn't want to do it anymore. And I had been going to Texas in the winter, so to get warm down there. And it was too many moves, Maine, Texas, back to New York, back down to Texas again. It was constantly moving, according to the seasons, and it's a lot of work to move a studio. So I didn't like doing that. And Texas, during the winter, I'd been working in New Jersey from these power plants and so on. And I thought they were spectacular there. And when I arrived, I was invited to give a lecture in Galveston, Texas. When I arrived there was all this Jersey marsh type, exactly the same kind of environment, oil rigs everywhere, and it was flat as a board. Same kind of wildlife migrate through there, and the birds, they sit right on those Athy wagons at the dump, full of trash, and they pick it clean. The insects that are attracted to that dump, to that stuff, to the garbage, are a wonderful feed for these birds. So you see these wading birds around on the dump in New Jersey. It's a very peculiar feeling. Anyway, there it was that I was sick of Maine is the answer to your question. Sick of my paintings of Maine.
But what was it? So when you left, then you left Galveston and went to Marfa and Presidio, and that was an even different landscape. And at one point, you talked about you were interested in how empty it was, that there was very little.
That's true. That's true.
And so, what did you find there that was so?
Well,
interesting
that was gorgeous to me. Yes, that emptiness and the lack of trees and bushes, very little to obscure it, and the lack of buildings. You had these endless expanses of yellow grass. And I'd once seen in the Metropolitan Museum a little watercolor by Theodore Rousseau of a field, and it was just a field with tracks going through it. And I thought, this is very poignant. This is the loneliness of working out in the landscape. This is many subjects that pulls in many thoughts, related to that. And I like that about Texas. It was a very wonderful, one of the few underpopulated parts of the country. And that's maybe reversing itself right now. Texas seems a very popular place to move to. Yeah.
So let's talk for a moment about John Marin. So when the museum celebrated its 50th anniversary, we produced a catalog, we published a catalog, and we asked a number of different artists and writers to write. And I called you up and I said, RACstraw, will you write for us? Because you should all know that RACstraw is not just a great artist, but a great writer and particularly a great art critic. And I said, you get first dibs. So you got to choose. And you chose John Marin. Which,
oh, really? You didn't send me John Marin?
No, you chose it. Really? No. But it seemed like such an interesting choice. And ultimately, I mean, you wrote brilliantly on Marin. And like the best art criticism, you see Marin better because of the way in which you interpret his work. At one point, you talk about Marin out-Turner's Venice in New York. I mean, you just had a great way of helping us think about Marin. But since we have this great exhibition right now, Modern Wonder, up of the Colby's collection of John Marin's work, could you?
Oh, do you? Yes, wonderful.
We do, which I would love to look at with you maybe after. But can you say a few words about what it is about Marin's work that is interesting to you and what you see in it?
Well, he definitely was interested in the exuberance of city life. And the exuberance of city life is barely differentiated for him between city and country life. He likes the exuberance of both. And the landscape is always in a sort of exuberant form. The waves are crashing. It's not tranquil, it's not like Joe Fiore at all.
Right.
Quiet. It's very animated kind of landscape. It's full of busyness and force. And you feel that at Cape Split when you go up there and visit, of course. It's a very beautiful place. Yeah, I thought that was much more important than perhaps wanting to attract, as Norma Boom did, to attract collectors who lived on yachts and who were out for the summer might pull in Cape Split. I felt this Marin-esque push, was very, very ardent on his part.
So, Rackstraw, maybe my last question will be about your most recent work. The
Yes.
1915, we have up here, and I'll come by in a moment, but the 1915 painting of the New York State Psychiatric Institute. There's 2015.
Right.
My gosh, you were working way back then, weren't you?
I painted both the Marians and the Downes.
You did, I know. 2015, you painted the New York Psychiatric Institute, and in 2017, you painted that incredible building in Lower Manhattan, the Vanton Tower Salt Shed, which if you're going up the West Side Highway, you see and you're like, what is that crazy building? And so they're architecturally incredibly interesting. So formally, I get why you would want them, but they don't seem arbitrarily selected by you. Can you say more about why those subjects in this recent work?
Well, I think that I have been for many years looking for, as I looked at the various machines and mechanisms that make refineries, for example. Refinery people at Exxon, who I met with to get permission to go in the refinery, said, we think we're the real modern abstract sculptors. And they have a point, they have a point. And so I have been interested in these wild structures in the landscape, just as you get in farming, some of these hay rakes and things that look pretty wild. I remember the first time I saw one of those hay rakes with 4 flails, diagonal, parallel to one another, and I thought, this looks like some kind of Japanese war, horse or something like that. I can't believe this thing. And so I've always been interested in that, the eccentricity of, well, not really eccentricity, because that salt box has made that's like a canonical building, I think, already. It's really magnificent, and I was very glad to find out that the architectural profession agrees. But I didn't know. It's my neighborhood. It's where I keep my car, just the other side of that thing. And I went by every day and saw it going up, and I thought, this is a great, fantastic shaped thing. It's wonderful. Its proportions are marvelous, and the inflection of the walls, so the light is constantly playing over that thing. It's really a remarkable work. And I'd always loved the thing next to it, the Holland Tunnel, the ventilation tower. That's another one. Bob Wilson used that in Einstein on the Beach. He obviously liked it too. And so that's, I think, something that I'm trying to do now. And I'm trying to apply that to interiors, because I have health problems, which have kind of probably put the end to my working outdoors. And so that's a whole new problem. And if you want to see it, you can. I'll do some shameless advertising now and say that the first interiors of my own place will be on show September 5th to mid-October at Betty Cunningham's Gallery in New York.
I can't wait. Well, speaking of that series, and we're showing one of those paintings here in the slideshow, they feel much more personal and intimate. And what has it meant for you to be painting your studio and in your work?
That's very hard. First of all, it is that I have no natural affinity for looking at those things except as beginning painters' problems, and how to make a beginning painter's problem with a chair and a table and not much else is a deeply difficult issue. And there are very few artists who can do it. But the work comes from inside the soul somehow, not from a conception or an idea. And that, the Baltus, for example, who was outside of the whole modernist idea of the thing, made chairs that are erotic. They really are, as well as little girls, which is controversial right now, rightly so perhaps, but the furniture is itself intense like that. And sometimes a tree or a bush, when he's looking out of a window painting, is also very, very intense in terms of its shaping. And that's something I'd like to take a crack at.
Well, I'm excited to see more of them. So, Rackstraw, would you entertain a few questions from our audience?
Oh, sure.
Great, and I think we have microphones that can get passed around.
And there are lots of your questions that didn't really get answered, actually.
You did a great job.
I wonder.
I see someone over here. Oh, please, yes. Yeah, I can barely see out here.
Oh, there. I wonder if you could say a little bit more. I'm here, in case you wonder. Here. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about scale. Because going back to some of the things Sharon was asking you about, the choice of the very banal, quotidian settings, and yet the scale kind of magnifies them. There's also the point of view, often, looking up, that gives them a really grand feel to them. So I know when you cringed when Sharon mentioned beard shot and this feeling of sublime in the landscape, and yet you're choosing topics, settings that we would never say are beautiful, and you give them that kind of grand, almost sublime dimension through the scale of the landscape, of the canvases, or the point of view, or even in smaller canvases, this panoramic dimension. I mean, there is a bit of a paradox there. So if you could talk about why those choices of scale and point of view.
Yeah, well, certainly the question of scale is terribly interesting to me. When I first started coming to Maine to paint during the summers, I remember one year I had real trouble finding what size the painting should be. I didn't have a comfortable scale that I was familiar with and comfortable with. And the next summer, I brought some of the previous year's work up with me, the old work, just to have around my own studio here to let me see where I felt I had been successful and gotten what I call scale. And the scale that I'm talking about really is not necessarily the enormous expanse, but it has to do with the weight and dynamism of the object in some kind of space, so that it creates its own aura around it, around the object itself. I don't know if that's any help to you. I'm not sure I've answered your question, but those are some thoughts on scale. It's not something you can measure. It's something you feel, and you may have to draw something many times over before you begin to get the feeling of it. And then you look at it and you say, that's it, that's got it. And it may sometimes be disturbed by the placement of an object too close to the eye of the viewer, and so they focus on that rather than the entire, so to speak, circumference or semicircle of space that you're trying to work on.
Thanks so much for making this experience possible. In looking at the slides flashing by, I was struck by the view south along the Harlem River and the convergence of the two ditches. There was strong distortion of the horizon and other ordinarily straight surfaces, much as a fisheye lens in a camera would show. And yet, all your other works are absolutely realistic, straight horizons, straight lines. Were you consciously trying to act the way a camera lens might in those two works?
No, I wasn't. I work directly from nature, and photographers and a photography critic once dragged me aside at an opening of an exhibition, and apparently he and someone else had a bet as to whether the painting that I had painted on was derived from a photograph or from reality. And I said, well, I'm afraid that you lose the bet, because it's not. I don't even own a camera. And his answer to that was, all artists lie. So I can't do much with that one.
Oh, Paula. Yeah.
Thank you so much for this wonderful conversation. It's been just a delight. And also thank you for forcing us to look at what our lives and our needs have created in our environment. It's good for us to see all of that. My question is, when you finished Fresh Kills, what was the public response to that painting and that type of statement?
Yeah, actually, not long after that painting, well, first of all, the public immediate reaction to at the show where it was first exhibited was that this museum bought it up. So that was very nice.
This museum.
This museum, yeah.
Just to clarify. and that would be Hugh Gorley, Rackstraw.
That's right.
So we should acknowledge Hugh.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Well, Hugh did extraordinary things for art around this part of the country. Mm-hmm. Extraordinary. Mm-hmm. Yes. Then later on, there was a movement to close fresh kilns. People on Staten Island were disgusted with the smell. I myself have a very poor sense of smell, so I was able to work there a whole summer long without being bothered by it at all. I mean, that is literally true. I didn't make that up to make a joke. But there was an exhibition called Artists Respond to the Closing of the Fresh Kilns landfill. And they put it on at Snug Harbor, and so there was the beginnings of an interest in what these things were. There was one particular artist who ran around the country and made it her business to redesign parts of the sanitation department buildings and put colored lights in them and so on. I don't remember her name. Do you?
Was it Latterman Ukele's?
Yes, exactly. Mm-hmm.
Muriel Latterman Ukele's.
It was very interesting. I didn't really like what she did, but I loved her interest in... I loved her interest in this topic, and her determination to try and get people aware of these things. And I thought it was a very serious campaign that she was mounting. And she, I think, was the initial idea behind that show at Snug Harbor. So it was okay. It was okay. People did not, at least people that I heard react, weren't repulsed by it or anything, or find it, I mean, anybody who does gardening, a little vegetable gardening for themselves, makes a compost pile. And, we're all involved with waste materials, all of us. And it's a very good thing we are.
Maybe one or two more.
Speaking of gardening.
Oh, there, Rackstraw, over Rackstraw.
Rackstraw, you once said to me that...
Who's talking?
Taking care of a garden in Maine took the same kind of energy that it takes to get through a painting and finish a painting, so that you actually, for a couple of summers, moved away from rural Maine and spent the summer in Portland so that you wouldn't, you're shaking your head, so that you wouldn't spend your time caring for your plants in your garden. And I've always remembered that because it said to me what an artist has to do to reshape their life, to take care of their art. And it's really helped me when I come to Maine not to have a garden.
I will say we have David Driscoll with us, who has one of the most beautiful gardens and is an amazing artist. So there can be a balance, but but I appreciate the rigor.
Yes, I certainly had a garden the summer I painted your Hathaway painting. I did. Yeah. I also had a drink. I told my dealer, Jill Combray, that I came home so exhausted and I had no idea whether my painting was progressing or not, and it was taking so long to paint that painting. And she said, just have a drink when you come home.
So maybe one more from Robert.
Hi. Could you mentioned that now some of the art comes from your soul. Can you talk about when you knew you wanted to be an artist?
Very early on.
Yeah.
Very early on. I wanted to be some kind of artist, yes. I was a solitary kid. I lived in a household that was very rambunctious, full of rambunctious boys. And it was extremely difficult for me to relate to them. I was by far the youngest. I was 6 years younger than the others. And I became, I retreated to an attic and had all kinds of things going on, creating little worlds up there of my own. And I think that's, in many ways, one of the original motivations that, for many people, is just simply some circumstance of solitude. Although, when artists, of course, famously get together in bars and seem to be very gregarious people, I think maybe they are gregarious in the evening because they were working all day. I think those family influences are very important, actually. My father was a somewhat reclusive guy, and he did a lot of ladies' tailoring later in his life, and he lived really upstairs in his tailoring shop, which was on the second floor, and he did not necessarily join us for meals, and was not, by and large, mostly there. He slept in a bunk bed that he'd built up above, and when I was requested to deliver his dinner to him in his room, and he opened the door and showed me a little bit. I just got a peek, and I saw a room there full of tailor's dummies and long slab pieces of plywood laid out on sawhorses, with pins in them, of all these patterns that he was making these tailored clothes. And I thought, here is somebody with his life all in one room, as well, his work, his leisure, everything. And that was very interesting to me, I must say. And I think that artists' lofts are the same sort of idea,
Thank you, Rackstraw.
Thank you.